Well, thank you all for coming. And today's presentation on the Shroud is going to take a little bit of a different twist, looking at a chapter in the history of the Shroud during World War II. And it's a kind of a fascinating study, and I hope you enjoy it. And the name of this presentation is Unholy Obsession: When Hitler Tried to Steal the Shroud. And some of you have maybe seen the movie Monuments Men, and so it's so not only did he try to steal all the artworks, he was looking after a lot of holy relics of the church as well. The Shroud in the modern era began in 1898. An obscure relic of the Catholic Church would be launched onto the world stage through the new technology of photography. Secondo Pia was an amateur photographer and was given permission to photograph the cloth with its mysterious image of a crucified man. So on the last day of this exhibition in 1898, he was given permission to photograph the Shroud, and this would be the first time it would ever be photographed. And the only image of the Shroud that had ever been seen up until this point was this kind of faint and kind of blurred image that we see on the Shroud. But what happened in his dark room that night when after he got his picture back was he saw this image, and this is the first time anyone had ever seen this image before. And the story goes is that Secondo Pia was so shocked by what he saw that he almost fell out of the window of his apartment. And it's and so this discovery of this image here, which is the image as it appears in a photo negative, would rattle the minds of secular academia and arouse the church to new excitement. And Pia's image of the Shroud as it appeared in a photo negative came to life. The face could now be seen in lifelike clarity, the exact opposite phenomenon of the photo negative image that we see here. So now, and it was the skeptics of academia, however, won the day by casting doubt on Pia's discovery, with some even accusing him of fraud. And as a result, Pia's photo negative would remain buried in doubt for another 33 years until May 3rd of 1931. And this is the beginning of the next 21-day exhibition. And it was in 1931, it was at the end of this 21-day exhibition that photographer Giuseppe Henri was allowed to photograph the cloth, and this time with much improved technology. And the same phenomenon occurred. Secondo Pia was vindicated, and now there was no doubt that this cloth and the man it depicted had some special and unexplained qualities. Now, something else was happening in Germany at this time. The pictures of the Shroud circulated the world, and this mysterious image would gain increasing interest from the medical experts, scientists, and historians, and even an emerging world dictator known as Adolf Hitler. In 1931, Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party and was making plans to run for president of Germany the very next year. And he would lose the election, but the Nazis would gain much power, and Hitler would be named Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Now, something else was happening in 1933. But Hitler was not the only one making news. The Shroud of Turin sparked intense interest after Henri's photographs were seen in magazines across the globe. And the Shroud was displayed again in 1933 for an encore exhibition, drawing further attention with a 22-day exhibition from September 24th until October 15th. And the Shroud would not be publicly exhibited again for 45 years, not until 1978. So on October 14th of 1933, the day before the close of the exhibition, Hitler announced that Germany would follow Japan's lead by withdrawing from the League of Nations. And one could interpret the connection between these two events as follows. As the burial linen that covered the light of the world was rolled up for safekeeping, the planet began its total plunge into darkness that would later be known as World War II and the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler was elected to power in 1934. The timing could not have been worse. That the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, crafted in World War I to limit Germany's ability to militarize, was set to expire in 1935. Hitler's war machine would soon be running at top speed. In 1938, Hitler was demanding to annex parts of Czechoslovakia. And on September 30th of that same year, France and the UK and Italy signed the Munich Agreement, and Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave his now famous speech, "Peace in Our Time." And this speech is now an icon of the failure of appeasement for dealing with enemies. We all know about that, right? So now, Hitler was not alone. Japan and Italy were also entertaining expansion through conquest. And Germany and Japan had formed an alliance and became known as the Axis powers in 1936. Italy joined the pack in 1937 with plans to annex parts of Yugoslavia. On September 1st of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and World War II had begun. On May 3rd, 1938, Adolf Hitler visited Italy for 7 days. And one of the cities he's visited was Turin. And the leader of his unholy entourage began questioning the church authorities about the shroud and how and where it was kept. Benito Mussolini was the prime minister of Italy and had been in power since 1930. And he was a committed fascist, but unlike Hitler, he did not entertain notions of an Aryan super race. Somewhat similar to England now, Italy was a monarchy. Now, King Umberto Emanuele III reigned as king from 1900 to 1946. Now, I got to stop right here and just say this. Now, I have had a mustache for a long time, but I'm impressed. I am truly impressed. I have to pay homage to someone who can grow a stash like that. So, at any rate, all the kings of Italy were descendants from the House of Savoy, which began their rule in the 11th century with significant land holdings in France and Italy. But over the centuries and through wars and the French Revolution, the Savoy's land holdings would gradually reduced and became concentrated in the Piedmont area of Italy, with Turin as the center. Now, what is known today as the Shroud of Turin became the possession of the House of Savoy in 1450, when they agreed to purchase it from Marguerite de Charnay, who inherited the sacred cloth from Geoffrey de Charnay, her grandfather, an honored knight who first exhibited the relic in Lorraine, France in 1356. Now, Geoffrey was not the first one to own it. The historical trail traces back through Constantinople and Edessa to at least the 6th century. In 1938, when Hitler's henchmen were investigating the shroud, the king, the cloth's rightful owner, became concerned for its safety. And so, in September 1939, right after Hitler invaded Poland, the shroud was taken to Rome and was transferred to the monastery at Montevergine, about 170 miles south of Rome. Only a few knew of its transfer, a secret they hoped would keep the holiest relic of Christendom out of the hands of Hitler. Now, some historians feel the shroud was removed for fear that it would be a casualty of war. Turin, as an industrial center, would likely be bombed. And however, Italy did not enter the war until 9 months later, in June of 1940, after Hitler invaded France. So the real motivation to move the Shroud in September of 1939 was directly due to Hitler's fascination with religious relics and the fear it would be stolen for sinister purposes. Now, Pope Pius the 12th wanted to take the Shroud to the monastery at Monte Cassino, about 80 miles southeast of Rome. However, others felt it would become a target because of its enormous size. It was decided to take it to the smaller, less conspicuous location, the Benedictine Abbey at Montevergine, near the town of Avellino. As history would record, the right decision was made because the Allies bombed Monte Cassino to smithereens, thinking that it would become a Nazi stronghold. And as it was, the Nazis ended up using it anyways. So after the Allies liberated Sicily, they moved north. And in 1943, Avellino was severely bombed. Fortunately, the monastery at Montevergine was 12 miles away, far enough to escape the Allied bombs. Now, once southern Italy was clearly in control of the Allies, King Umberto summoned Mussolini, stripped him of his office of prime minister, and had him arrested. He was sent to prison. Now, the Germans still occupied the northern half of the country. Italy was now in civil war. Now, the new prime minister, Pietro Badoglio, officially surrendered to the Allies in September of 1943 and pledged allegiance to the Allied cause. In a daring rescue mission by the Nazis, Mussolini was rescued from his prison by German paratroopers and brought to Berlin. Although he was ready to abandon politics, Hitler convinced him to return to Italy and set up the Italian Socialist Republic in the northern half of the country. He had little choice because Hitler threatened to destroy the cities of Milan, Turin, and Genoa if he did not comply. Now, by April of 1945, the war was almost over. The Germans would surrender in May. Mussolini and his mistress were attempting to escape to Switzerland. They and other members of the fascist government were caught by fighters of the communist underground, and they were all shot by firing squad and hung upside down in the public square. So now we need to look at why Hitler was obsessed with the occult and what spawned his fascination with religious artifacts, and most importantly, the Shroud of Turin. One of the most famous relics to fall into his possession was the Spear of Longinus, named after the centurion who allegedly pierced the side of Jesus before the Romans could release it, or before the Romans would release his body to Joseph for burial. Now, in the 1973 book by historian Trevor Rosencroft, documented this whole episode of Hitler's obsession. Today, there exist 3 different spears that all contend to be the Holy Lance. The one with the strongest claim, or at least the oldest provenance, is in the Hofburg Museum in Vienna, Austria. Now, this spear can be traced back through history to the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Now, a legend grew around this spear that the lance and that whoever possessed it would be able to conquer the world. Napoleon attempted to obtain this lance after the Battle of Austerlitz, but it had been smuggled out of the city, and he never obtained it. According to legend, Charlemagne carried the spear through 47 successive battles, but died when he accidentally dropped it. Oops. That's a big oops. So, whatever you do, don't drop the spear. The spear finally wound up in Austria and became part of the treasure collection stored in the Hofburg Museum. It was in September of 1912 that a young Adolf Hitler visited this museum and learned of the lance and its reputation. Now, by coincidence, he overheard a tour guide point to the spear and say, "This spear is shrouded in mystery. Whoever unlocks its secrets will rule the world." Now, Hitler said later that those words changed his entire life. He believed that the spear possessed secret occult powers, and he invited those powers to invade his soul. Dr. Walter Stein was an eyewitness to the event. He stood right next to this 20-year-old Hitler when he gazed at the spear and described him as follows. This is according to this Dr. Stein. He says, Adolf Hitler was like a man in a trance, a man over whom some dreadful magic spell had been cast. He was swaying on his feet as though caught up in some inexplicable euphoria. His whole facial appearance and stance appeared to be transformed, as if some mighty spirit now invaded his very soul, creating within him and around him a kind of evil transformation of its own nature and power. Now, and then Hitler, in his own words, writes this: I stood there quietly gazing upon it for several minutes, quite oblivious to the scene around me. It seemed to carry some hidden inner meaning which evaded me, a meaning which I felt I inwardly knew, yet could not bring to consciousness. I felt as though I myself had held it before in some earlier century of history, that I myself had once claimed it as my talisman of power and held the destiny of the world in my hands. Sounds like a complete megalomaniac, doesn't it? I myself held this spear back in prior centuries, right? And held the destiny of the world in my hands, right? Man, this guy was nuts. And so the spear was brought to Nuremberg. It says, then on March 12th of 1938, Hitler began his quest in earnest when the Nazi army rolled into Austria without any resistance. With 7 million ethnic Germans already living there, they were excited to be part of a new emerging Germany. Now with Austria under Hitler's control, he ordered the spear and other items in the Hofburg Museum to be sent to Nuremberg, Germany, the center of the Nazi movement. Now, isn't it interesting? So the very first thing Hitler did was to make sure that he obtained the spear of destiny. That was his first goal. Then he felt he could then move on for the rest of his conquest. On April 30th of 1945, kind of fast forward about 6 years or so, at 2:10 p.m., advancing American forces took possession of the vault and the spear. 80 minutes later, Adolf Hitler died by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. So, kind of like Charlemagne, dropped the spear, oops. Now, George Patton thought that he thought that the lance was authentic, and he is actually the one that did the historical tracing back to the time of Constantine. And now, some historians question Hitler's involvement with the occult. However, one does not have to look far to find a strong influence. The famous swastika, which you see at the top of both of these emblems here, this was an occult symbol of the Theosophical Society and a symbol of the Aryan race. In 1920, the symbol was adopted by the National Socialist Party, known as the Nazis. Now, the entire notion of an Aryan race, of highly evolved humans, is rooted in the occult teachings of Theosophy, founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Now, the concept of eugenics, or mass extermination of so-called less evolved humans, came out of her writings. In fact, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a theosophist and is quoted as saying, Quote, "The most merciful thing a large family can do to one of its infant members is to kill it." Isn't that something? Margaret Sanger. The most prominent occultist during World War II was Heinrich Himmler. He was the Grand Master of several secret societies and organized satanic black magic masses performed in medieval castles across Germany. Himmler was responsible for much of the terror created during the Third Reich. In 1929, Himmler would become leader of Hitler's personal bodyguard service. Guarding the would-be savior of the German people would require a large force of men, and so by 1933, the SS, as it was known, had grown to 52,000 men. All had to meet with Himmler to ensure that they were Aryan and would be willing to die in protection of Hitler. He was also head of the Gestapo, a brutal police force largely involved in rounding up enemies of the state. But most notably, he was in charge of Hitler's final solution against all Jews. Himmler was an evil, brutal man and close personal friends with Hitler. Another proof of Hitler's involvement with the occult can be found in his famous book, Mein Kampf. Hitler dedicated it to his teacher, Dietrich Eckart, a committed Satanist who had much influence on him in the early 1920s. Eckhart was considered the spiritual leader of the Nazi movement. He saw in Hitler a young leader he could mold. He began introducing him to key members of the Thule Society and began communicating with entities they believed were of extraterrestrial origin. That's interesting. Now, this is what Eckhart writes himself, as he lay dying in 1923. He says, "Follow Hitler. He will dance, but it is I who have called the tune. I have initiated him into the secret doctrine and opened his centers in vision and given him the means to communicate with the powers, capital P. Do not mourn for me. I shall have influenced history more than any other German." And again, another megalomaniac. It's always I. See that? I did this, with the help of the powers. Well, he did influence Germany more than any other man. And I hope he's proud of himself as he rots in hell. In Hitler's twisted, depraved, occult mind, he had convinced himself that Jesus was not a Jew, but was of an Aryan bloodline. Imagine, go figure that. A bloodline that was once pure. Hitler's genocide was an attempt to purify the bloodline once again, the belief that the Aryan bloodline had become polluted with all this inbreeding. And so both Hitler and Himmler became obsessed with finding and acquiring artifacts related to Christ, believing that these artifacts would give them special powers to ensure their success in implementing the Third Reich. Because you gotta figure, why would they be after things that contain the blood of Christ? Only if you didn't believe that Christ was, number one, Jewish, or number two, that he was the Messiah, but somehow he was one of these aliens that they somehow communicated with, right? So there's little doubt of Hitler's obsession with the occult. Now, why would implements of Christ's passion be of interest? What was the power of the spear of Longinus? The answer is the blood. Not just any blood, the blood of Christ. Hitler wanted to harness that power for himself. Remember that old song, "There's Power in the Blood"? Even Hitler knew that, except he in his weird mind, he thought he could use that power for his own purposes, kind of like Judas, It's now Hitler was interested in using history as his guide to greatness. After Germany's humiliating defeat in World War I, he tried to find links to history, archaeology, and mythology to show how the German people were destined for greatness. This gave birth to the Aryan myth of light skin, blonde hair, blue-eyed people as genetic links to a future human race. or a future super race. Hitler attempted to create a new order based around the Holy Grail. Now, he believed that eternal life offered by the Grail was only for the pure-blooded and the noble of the Aryan race. His brotherhood of the Knights of the Holy Grail would have an eternal reign, and he compared his aristocracy to that of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Can you imagine this? Hitler, the new Camelot? You kidding me? So, anyways, Himmler was also obsessed with the Grail and took charge of the historical research. He set up an elite Nazi research institute called the Anarby. And he was so convinced that they would find it that he completely renovated a castle to be the new Grail Castle and would be the center of the new Camelot. Can you? This is the deception here just boggles the mind. Now, Himmler assigned Otto Rahn, an expert on the Grail, to search for this elusive relic. He traveled through Europe and the Middle East and all the places where the Grail allegedly might have been, and on his quest. And his extensive search found nothing. And so perhaps because of failure to find the Grail and fearing the reaction of Himmler, he committed suicide in 1939. Now, the character Indiana Jones is based on Otto Rahn. However, instead of running from the Nazis, he was working with the Nazis. So a little bit of Hollywood twist there on that character. Now, Hitler also desired the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred box containing the original stone tablets of the Ten Commandments given to Moses. But despite the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's no evidence that any concerted effort was made to find the Ark. The three items he did in fact search for all have the common denominator of bearing the blood of Christ: the spear, the shroud, and the Grail. Now, the Grail, legends all tell of Joseph of Arimathea taking the chalice to the site of the cross and collecting the blood as it dripped from Jesus' side. And so in some way, Hitler, knew that there was power in the blood of Christ, and perhaps in Hitler's twisted mind, he could manipulate it for his own personal gain. We know how that worked out, don't we? Hitler had the spear, the Grail was nowhere to be found, but the shroud could be tracked down. Now, few people knew of the shroud's transfer to Montevergine, and only the abbot and the two priests at the monastery knew that it was there. Now, for secrecy and safety, the shroud and its very obvious silver reliquary was placed in a plain wooden box and then put inside the altar inside a small choir chapel. Now, the altar was skirted with wood paneling, in effect creating a secret compartment. And none of the monks at the abbey knew that it was there, only the abbot and two other priests. Now, by 1943, the tides of war began to turn against Hitler's forces. The Allies, having taken back Sicily, were now marching north from the southern boot of Italy, with General Patton leading the charge. In April of 1943, the Nazis had gone to Turin looking for the famous relic and were told it wasn't there. Sorry, guys, it's not here anymore. We don't know where it is. But did they find out? Did they apply some enhanced interrogation techniques and discover where the shroud was taken? I mean, we're really not sure about that. But here's something interesting. In September of 1943, the Allies were moving north, and the Nazis supposedly saw light reflecting off the windows of the monastery high in the hills, and they thought Allied spies were trying to send signals. So they raced up the hill to the monastery under the cover of darkness. and pounding on the door, and then they demanded entry, saying that they were looking for spies. But were they looking for something else? Did they know that the shroud was there? Now, as the Germans searched room by room, the abbot ordered all of the monks to gather in that choir chapel where the shroud was hidden inside the altar. He hoped that seeing the monks gathered in prayer would deter the Nazis from looking too closely. And his gambit worked, because one of the Nazi officers said, "Don't bother the monks, let them pray." And the soldiers gave up and left without finding any spies or the shroud, even though it was hidden only a few feet away. Was divine intervention at work here, protecting the shroud once again, as it had so often over the centuries from fire and war? The final act of King Umberto II, the shroud's rightful owner, was to allow the sacred cloths return to Turin. The monarchy had been abolished and had been replaced with a republic. The shroud was returned to Turin on October 29, 1946. Soon after that, the king fled to Portugal, where he remained in exile, but he allowed the shroud to stay in Turin. Now, before he passed away in 1983, he willed the shroud to the current living pope. So as of 1983, the shroud became property of John Paul, and then later Benedict XVI, and now belongs to Francis. And so I guess each pope wants to have an exhibition on their watch, and so the shroud will be on exhibit again next year from mid-April to mid-June. The shroud was taken out of Turin for 7 years, the most prominent number in the Bible associated with God, the divine number of perfection. It was hidden from the very enemies of God by a group of praying monks. The shroud would go on to become the most analyzed artifact in the world and a powerful symbol of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And as Paul Harvey would always say, and now you know the rest of the story. Thank you very much. Now, sorry about the technical glitches at the beginning. I guess my mouse didn't work very well. So, but does anyone have any questions? I'll try to answer. Yes, right here. The shroud is in Turin. Has been there ever since ever since the early 1500s. Yes, exactly. Now, I have 2 more presentations for you to think about. Tomorrow morning at 8:30 is 7 Secrets of the Sacred Shroud. And then tomorrow afternoon from 3:30 to 4:30, Barry Schwartz, the documenting photographer of the Shroud, John and Rebecca Jackson. John Jackson is a physicist. He was involved with the Shroud project. And we'll be, I don't know, I think we're in the Rock Rimmon room to do a Q&A. And then tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, I'll be doing a presentation in the main auditorium called God is in the Details. And fortunately for those presentations, I'm not going to need notes. I needed notes on this one because this is brand new for me, and I'm really not, I can't do the material just from memory. So anyways, where's Casper? There he is. Casper, come on up here. You're going to have a real treat here. Casper McLeod is just a wonderful musician, and he's actually written a song about the Shroud that I just love, and he's gonna play it for you right now.
same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. I cannot imagine how he suffered in my place. Someday I will thank him face to face. Surely he has risen. Truly he is the Son of God. By his love he is willed. By his stripes we are healed. Tears in their eyes. Some seem so hopeful, others asking why. And yet it is written, these things will take place for those who know the truth.